concern for the public good was one of the great concerns of the Roman empires, particularly in the early days. And in that vein, you can find few examples of individuals who were who were more concerned with this rather than than Seneca, the Roman, who was an example of Roman Stoicism. Now, remember, Stoicism comes from the Greek primarily, but with an emphasis on self-control, moderation, reason, anti-emotionalism, a kind of detachment, and also a kind of cosmopolitanism. The theory itself, the philosophy itself, stems, as I said, from the Greeks primarily. The figure of Diogenes loomed large in the imagination, who stated this cosmopolitan ethos, saying, "I am not an Athenian or a Corinthian, but a citizen of the world." And there you see also the detachment, the idea that you are not necessarily linked to one particular identity, you are more wedded to the idea of the right, of the correct, of ethics, of justice. The primary individual we're dealing with here in Rome, however, is, of course, Seneca, known as Seneca the Younger. His father was Seneca the Elder, and he was a person of some merit in his own right. Seneca the Younger was born in 4 BC. He lived to 65 AD. He was a philosopher. He was a statesman. He was a tutor and advisor to Emperor Nero, and he was also a very noted playwright of the Roman Silver Age. He wrote a number of satires and some really good tragedies. Really interesting playwright. His end did not come particularly well. He was forced. He was exiled to Corsica in 41 AD when he was linked to a conspiracy. You fall out of favor if in politics, especially in the Roman times, if you align yourself with one person, that person can suddenly change their mind about you, or they could fall out of power and you are suddenly on the out. So he was exiled to Corsica for about 8 years. Not the worst thing in the world. He had some time to kill, and he was in and out of public government for most of his adult life anyway. But then he was brought back, and for a little bit there, he enjoyed a sort of semi-retirement. And that, of course, ended badly as well, and he was forced to kill himself in 65 AD. Now, the primary writing that we're concerned with here is a group of letters he wrote called the Epistulae Morales ad Lucilium, which means essentially moral letters to Lucilius. Lucilius is a friend of his, and he's giving advice, very informal advice. It's written in a kind of informal style, but certainly it was intended as well to be something that would be read by posterity. The collection is, what is it? It's 124 letters. All written when he's in semi-retirement, so he's really mulling over the practicality and the essential of the Stoic philosophy as he sees it and as it should be put into practice. And of these 147, we're concerned primarily here with Epistle 47. Where he talks to Lucilius about the practice of slavery. Now, he does not come out and say slavery is bad. He does not say anything against slavery as an institution itself. Of course, the Roman Empire is largely built on slavery, so he wasn't going to come that square against it. But he does question the notion of cruelty as a tool of slavery or a product of slavery, if you will. He sees slavery as something to be moderated within moderate bounds. As a Stoic, everything is good, but we must keep it very calm and moderate. As I said, the language that he writes in is very informal. You can hear that just in the way he starts off. Now, translations are translations, and if you take anything from Latin can sound naturally very august. But his Latin is, I am told, relatively accessible. I'm glad to hear from these people who've been visiting you that you live on friendly terms with your slaves. Very casual approach. Very, hey, this is good. Interesting also that political spin of it, where he says, I'm glad to hear that you are kind to your slaves. Now, if his entire message here is a criticism of cruelty towards slaves, he is certainly starting on the positive note. He's finding a way to introduce this topic in a very non-confrontational, political way. You could see him being a political advisor in his adulthood, as he was throughout his adult years. This is the mark of a writer who is somewhat skilled in political and diplomatic maneuvering in testy circumstances. And you can see in this informality, in this casualness, you can see more of the Stoic theme playing out, because it is a kind of conversationality that blends with society. The tone of the letter is very friendly and inoffensive, and so you get a sense of a moderate temperament, a temperament that is accepting, but looking to correct little imperfections, perhaps. It is not a strident tone. He's not trying to condemn anyone. He's just trying to nudge society in the proper direction. And his primary issue here is that too many people are, or too many slave holders are cruel to their slaves. He criticizes particularly the slaves who were waiting at the dinner table. This is why I laugh at those people who think it degrading for a man to eat with his slave. Why do they think it degrading? Only because the most arrogant of conventions has decreed that the master of the house be surrounded at his dinner by a crowd of slaves who have to stand around while he eats more than he can hold, loading an already distended belly in his monstrous greed until it proves incapable of any longer of performing the function of a belly, at which point he expends more effort in vomiting everything up that he did in forcing it down. You can see again the condemnation of immoderation. Here, the slaveholder in question is a immoderate consumer, somebody who is eating so much that he's going to have to vomit, and that pose is very significant, because then that image of the slovenliness, of the piggishness, quite frankly, of the slave master, is really, that's what he sinks in right away, right at the very, very beginning of the letter. So that's the impression he's working with. And then he goes through how the slaves have to, stand around and wait for this guy to finish making a pig of himself, and the very offense of just denying their humanity. That, well, they have to sit around and watch me be an animal. he invites, Seneca suggests that, well, why don't you try inviting some of your slaves to eat with you instead of just standing there watching you make a pig of yourself? And this again is sort of a who would do that sort of thing. But his point is that by engaging with them as human beings, it is in fact diffusing some of the anger that boils up, some of the resentment that churns up in the practice, in the institution of slavery. The idea that you would address your slaves with some respect for their basic humanity. Now, he addresses this as a number of different ways and suggests also that, well, a lot of the people who had slaves got them in war, but just a slight turn of fate, and they could have been taken prisoner, and they could have been made slaves. So there's really no sense of a hereditary slave slave quality that you can lean on and say, well, they're not people, they're just slaves. But also that notion of, well, this is just luck. Luck is precarious. Prudence would suggest that you want to cover your bets a little bit more. And here you see a little bit more the idea of cosmopolitanism, the idea that, it is a wide world out there. There are lots of different people in it, and we need to value them individually. But also you cannot ignore that by doing this, you are not attacking slavery itself. You are allowing it to continue with greater smoothness, just a little bit more unimpeded. People are less likely to rebel against you if you are nice to them. It is a northern, it is the slaveholding strategy of the northern states in the lead up to the American Civil War, let's say, where you're just a little bit nicer to them and they're less objectionable, and not like those deep South states where they're just inhuman to them. There is that note of basic conservatism running throughout. Don't you notice too how our ancestors took away all odium from the master's position and all that seemed insulting and degrading in the lot of the slave by calling the master father of the household and speaking of the slaves as members of the household? Whenever somebody comes up with that pose of, how our ancestors did it, well, back in the good old days, things were different. Things were better. People were just more respectful. And the idea of identifying, again, you got to give him credit for this. He is identifying that, okay, the slaves are not necessarily slaves. They are members of the household. They are on the team, not beneath it. So there is that. There is a basic dignity of the human being that that needs respecting, but it does allow for a little something going on there that is perhaps not completely ethical or moral. But a Roman wouldn't necessarily see it as completely unethical or unethical or immoral. Significantly, you can argue that a number of different ways. He seems to be hinting at certain things that maybe he knows as a politician, not to say too out loud that would turn everybody against him. So he's just trying to work the edges a little bit. But you see also a basic concern with a parallelism, if you will, of the individual and the state. He's been arguing that slavery as an institution turns people into somewhat arrogant and crass animal qualities. Remember the porcine image at the beginning. Talking about it, and in the household they allowed the slaves to hold official positions and to exercise some jurisdiction in it. In fact, they regarded the household as a miniature republic. Miniature republic. There, he's really seems to me nudging the the parallelism between the individual and the state, and almost where the individual becomes a metonymy of the state, where the individual is a representation of the state. And while it is questionable how far he wants to push it, certainly he seems to be criticizing the idea that slavery can exist within the individual and without harming the individual. And by extension, then, can slavery exist within the state without harming the state? I think it's an open question. It's certainly, you can make that argument on in a lot of different ways. He winds up the letter with a full-throated condemnation, if you will, of the role of the individual slaveholder. You know, he says, we assume the mental attitudes of tyrants. Tyrants is a very strong word here. And the idea that it corrupts you, which is, again, something that Jefferson would honestly talk about later on in the American example. And Jefferson was a great reader of Seneca. For they forget their own strength and helplessness of others, and grow white hot with fury, as if they had received an injury, when all the time they are quite immune from any such danger through the sheer exaltedness of their position. White hot fury jumps out at me right there, because you see in this a great emotionalism, a great immoderation, a great attachment rather than detachment coming through that. The idea that the last thing a Stoic really wants to allow to happen is for emotions to bubble up, for the public to get into a frenzy. We want to keep things calm. We want to keep things unemotional. We want to keep things exalted and reasonable as much as possible, because otherwise you have chaos. The very ending of the letter. But I won't keep you any longer. You don't need an exhortation. It is a mark of a good life that, among other things, it satisfies and abides. Satisfies and abides sounds very calming. Like, okay, my words satisfy and abide. They're not looking to exhort anything. They're not looking to stir things up. Bad behavior, constantly changing, not for the better, simply into different forms, has none of this stability. Stability is where he sticks the landing. Stability is the goal. Stability is what he's trying to tell. This is in his retirement, in his later years. Stability is what he's trying to tell Romans is the goal. You want stability. His life had been unstable. His life had been tumultuous somewhat with the twistings and turnings of political fates, the exile and the return and the ultimate suicide condemnation. But that good-bad characterization of stability is good and constantly changing is bad. The Stoics liked stability. The Stoics liked reserve. That is a fundamentally and definitionally conservative position, but in this case, it is one that is seeking to subvert an institution in some minor way. Perhaps, yes, not yanking it out by the roots, but altering it just a little so that the society can survive its own predisposition for tumult.